And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hydepark on Ada Derana 24. Tonight's exclusive at Hydepark is with the visiting IMF Senior Mission Chief for Sri Lanka, Peter Breuer. A very warm welcome to you. Ayubowan.
Ayubowan.
Good to have you at Hydepark once again.
Thank you so much for having us. It's always good talking to you.
This time around, the setting in Sri Lanka is quite different. A new government with a strong backing of a people's mandate is in place. Of course, officials are probably similar to the same officials you have been working with from the previous government as well. But my question is how the IMF views Sri Lanka's situation currently, many months after the IMF program, into a more deeper agreement with the IMF. How does the IMF view Sri Lanka's current situation from an economic perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sri Lanka has come a long way since I first came to Sri Lanka 2.5 years ago. The recovery has really been remarkable in Sri Lanka. We can see this growth in the 4 quarters to June of this year has been on average 4%. And that compares to having lost 15% of the country's GDP during the crisis in dollar terms. So the recovery is well underway. I think it shows that the reforms are paying off. Inflation has come down significantly from 70% to even below the inflation target of 5% now. There are many achievements that this country has had during the program, and I think that augurs well for the future. Of course, the change in government, there were fair elections, so we now work with a new government. This government, as you said, has a strong mandate, and that helps also in terms of political stability. Political stability is a very important precondition to ensure macroeconomic stability, and that is a good basis for continuing with the economic reforms so that Sri Lanka can really emerge in a durable manner out of this crisis.
You also mentioned how you've been working continually with Sri Lanka since Sri Lanka plunged into crisis and the ongoing discussions. President Anurakkumara Dissanayaka's main campaign pledge was, of course, to go with the IMF, but there were amendments that the government was also seeking, or even the campaign mentioned that certain changes will be made to Sri Lanka's agreement with the IMF in principle. Has there been any discussion or proposals to make changes, amendments to the ongoing agreement?
So we had a good set of discussions, and these came against the background of the new government announcing almost immediately after it was elected that it would continue with the IMF reforms as well as continue with the debt restructuring that's ongoing in Sri Lanka. And that was reflected in the discussions we had while we were here over the last 8 days or so. We reached staff level agreement on a set of policies that would accommodate the authorities' plans and priorities within the guardrails of the IMF program. So we're here for the 3rd review. A review is always a good opportunity to look at the program, looking back, how has it evolved over time, how have the indicators changed, what have been the developments, and then looking ahead, what is the appropriate set of policies in order to continue on a positive trajectory to make sure that there is stable and inclusive growth. And this is what we did in the context of these discussions, and hence managed to find a way that stays within these guardrails of the program while accommodating the authorities' priorities.
So just to clarify again, there haven't been any changes to the initial agreement or the program that has been agreed to by Sri Lanka with the IMF?
So some of the guardrails that are really cornerstones of the program especially in the fiscal area, relate to the so-called primary surplus, that is essentially the fiscal resources that the country collects, not taking into account interest payments, over which it doesn't have so much control always. So that's an important cornerstone. The tax collection, the revenue collection, this was a major factor that led to the crisis in 2021. Sri Lanka was one of the lowest tax collecting countries in the world, which led to the crisis. So bringing that back up is another important component of the program. And also the quality of fiscal measures is something that we discuss. For example, having a tax regime that is progressive is something that we would be concerned about. So those are the guardrails of the program. Within that, there's always flexibility to adjust certain things in line with what the government's priorities are, and these will eventually be made public by the government when it submits its budget to the parliament.
Certainly. You mentioned about the tax revenue targets. I'd like to speak about it shortly, but prior to that, the outcomes, you mentioned the discussions that a set of the policies were agreed upon, and the IMF had with the newly elected government, the outcomes you mentioned briefly. But if you can also talk about the focus during the third review and the outcomes specifically and the goals set for Sri Lanka.
So essentially, for us, the main objectives of the program, of the IMF-supported program, remain the same as previously. So that pertains to a revenue-based fiscal consolidation, while at the same time ensuring that the social safety nets are adequate, and also making sure that there are no contingent risks from, for example, state-owned enterprises, and that includes cost recovery pricing, very important pillar. The second pillar, of course, is ensuring price stability and external viability. So bringing inflation down, having a central bank that can decide what is needed to do in order to ensure price stability, and building reserves. This was another key cause of the crisis, that the country had run out of reserves. So rebuilding these reserves is an important component. Restoring debt sustainability, very important part of the program, because ultimately Sri Lanka needs to be able to roll over the debt that it has, and it can only do that if the debt is in fact sustainable. The other aspects that we discussed, such as structural reforms, governance in particular. So as you know, this government has a particular focus on governance reforms and fighting corruption, and also on strengthening the social safety net. So these are two issues that are very close to our hearts. You may know that the program actually has a minimum spending requirement in it. The government is required to spend at least somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7% of GDP on social safety nets. But unfortunately, it hasn't been able to meet that requirement since December last year, for good reasons, because it's been difficult to open bank accounts for the intended recipients. But it is important to make progress to overcome these impediments. And in the discussions, we put a lot of emphasis on this, and we feel that the government is very committed to this specific issue, but also to the overall economic reform agenda.
Right. The third, or rather the fourth tranche following the third review would be made available before the end of this year. That has been the agreement or understanding from statements made by the President recently and the central bank governor himself earlier. The IMF, what does the IMF have to say?
So the elections delayed things just a little. Ordinarily, we would have been here on mission in September like we were last year.
Right.
And that would have led to a board meeting in, roughly speaking, December, as was the case for the first review. With the elections in the middle, We didn't want to interfere with that, of course, and not have a review in the middle of the elections, but it's, of course, of prime importance to let the democratic process play out. So as soon as the parliamentary election was over, we came to Sri Lanka to start, to continue the discussions on the third review. So naturally, the disbursement, with that slip in time, the disbursement will also slip a bit in time. The key factor in this will be a so-called prior action, meaning an action that is expected by the authorities to be taken, and that, in this case, pertains to the budget that they will be submitting to the parliament, where it's important that that budget be in line with the program objectives. And as soon as that is the case, we will then be able to proceed with the executive board meeting.
Has there any discussion been on what the budget focus should be in order to be in line, in tandem with the IMF program?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the primary surplus is, of course, an important objective because that is the cornerstone of restoring debt sustainability. There are many different ways of getting to the same primary surplus, and we discussed many different options. Also, how to ensure that the revenue mobilization continues. This really, if you look at the program, there have been tax revenues have already increased by 5 percentage points of GDP, roughly speaking. We went from somewhere of 7 point something percent of GDP to somewhere 12 point something percent of GDP in 2024. So that really is a remarkable achievement. The one big step remaining is for the 2025 budget. Where we are talking about, roughly speaking, about 1.5 percentage points of GDP that are still needed in terms of measures to get to the main objective.
Revenue collection?
In revenue collection. In 2026 and 2027, the additional effort is rather small by comparison to these achievements thus far in the program.
As you say, talk about the 2025 budget and the expected revenue targets. The present government's campaign was that they would abolish value-added tax for certain essential commodities as well, and targets set by the IMF program for 2025 end is the achievement of a 15% tax to GDP ratio. Is that achievable with the current government's proposals that certain revenue collection measures will be abolished and maybe pose a potential risk to collection?
So the value-added tax is an important part of the tax collections in Sri Lanka. They amount to about 1/3 of tax collections. And indeed, as you might remember earlier in the program, we had extended discussions with the then government about VAT exemptions that were quite prevalent throughout Sri Lanka. The 2024 budget of the current year eliminated most, not all, but most value-added tax exemptions, and that was a gain of about 1.2 percentage points of GDP, which is very significant. So VAT will continue to be an important source of collection. Exemptions really have not served Sri Lanka very well in terms of addressing the causes of its crisis. So we had, in one of our staff reports, it might have been the second or the first review, we looked at what has been the value of these tax exemptions. And in 2024, the value of these tax exemptions, they amounted to about 4 percentage points of GDP, when the country was collecting 7% of GDP. And since then, as I just mentioned, it has undergone an effort of 5 percentage points of GDP in revenue collection. If you put the 4% in relation to the 5% of effort, it just gives you an impression of how significant these exemptions have been. And that is really something that may be worth looking at Of course, we have managed to reduce that number because of the VAT exemptions being mostly eliminated, but there are still considerable exemptions in Sri Lanka.
What measures do you think could be proposed to really elevate the pressure on the average common man in Sri Lanka? We're talking about revenue collection targets that Sri Lanka has to continue to meet with the ongoing program. Yes, this is because Sri Lanka fell into a crisis, and there is an ongoing program to look at ways to come out of it in a structured manner. And also you mentioned about social safety net, how in a structural manner it should be improved. So with all this, is there an alternative proposal by the IMF for revenue collection?
So the impact of the crisis, no doubt, has been very, very large on everybody in Sri Lanka. For example, inflation. Everybody faced these very high prices. The poor people are least equipped to deal with it because they have no buffers to deal with these very high prices. For example, we went, during one of our missions, we went to Nuora Eliya and met with some estate workers who showed us their bills and who showed us their income slips. And it was just shocking how the high costs of electricity and other things were essentially absorbing all their income. Better off people are better equipped with dealing with this high inflation, and so it continues to be very important that those who can make a contribution to society do that, and that they do that in line with their ability to contribute. So having a personal income tax system, a corporate income tax system that asks richer people, better off people for more contributions is very important for the government to deliver the essential services that it needs to deliver, and that everybody is looking to the government to deliver, including support for the poor people.
Again, I'd like to go back to the campaign period, and the IMF has been, your name, the IMF has been a major point of discussion here in Sri Lanka's political circles, at major national election campaigns as well. But the IMF program, is it really necessary for a country like Sri Lanka? You've been resident representative in countries where debt crisis has been either maybe solved or an IMF program was implemented. With your experiences, is it really essential for Sri Lanka to go with the IMF here? If not, what would have been the situation for Sri Lanka? Because we have seen financing coming from other countries. India supported Sri Lanka through the crisis, and we've seen multilateral agencies, development agencies also working with the country. But there are suggestions that Sri Lanka could have done better without the IMF.
So the IMF provides a way for a government to commit itself in a credible way to a set of policies that are appropriate to the circumstances that it's facing. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's a set of policies, I was describing the objectives of the program a minute ago, that will help or have already helped for Sri Lanka to emerge from the crisis. So it's a commitment that the government makes first and foremost to itself, because it is essentially the government's program. It is, of course, negotiated with the IMF because the idea is to find a way together that addresses the causes of the crisis, while at the same time taking into account the constraints and considerations that a government and knowing the country much better than us brings to the table. So the IMF allows the country to commit itself to this policy, and also to demonstrate to the outside world that it is committed to these policies and deserving of the support from the outside world. That support, of course, includes financial support from the IMF, but not only the IMF. Usually an IMF program has a very catalytic role. It helps trigger support from other multilateral agencies. In the case of Sri Lanka, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank are very important contributors. And in the case of Sri Lanka, where you have the debt restructuring, where creditors are being asked to provide debt relief to essentially give up some of their own savings in order to help Sri Lanka emerge from the crisis. In that situation, of course, it's also important to convince those creditors that Sri Lanka is doing everything that is needed that will allow it to service the debt that comes out of the debt restructuring going forward, so as to avoid a situation where these same creditors might be asked, for more debt relief. So this really is a very important device, both from committing and executing policies that help the country emerge from the crisis, and from obtaining the needed financing.
Are you saying Sri Lanka's continuance with the IMF program will bring relief and stability to the country, and also in working with the outside world, whether it's investors or creditors?
It already has over the program started in March 2023, so a year and a half. Of course, we started working with Sri Lanka on the policies already when we reached the original staff level agreement on September 1st in 2022. Many policies were already set in place immediately then. So I think the outcomes that we have seen in terms of growth, in terms of inflation, and many indicators you look at have shown that already Sri Lanka has benefited from these policies. Poverty is an important indicator as well. It's still very high, but the trajectory, at least the data we have seen from the World Bank, the trajectory is a good one in terms of it coming down. So sticking with the reforms will be an important part to continue on this trajectory to ensure stable and inclusive growth, where the benefits of the growth are shared across the population, including the poor people.
Mm-hmm. What kind of understanding does the IMF have of the perspective of the international investors on Sri Lanka, and the potential now for gaining trust among investors, and also the investment climate in Sri Lanka?
So macroeconomic stability is a very important precondition in order to attract foreign investment. The rule of law, a set of frameworks and rules that work, where people respect the guidelines and the rules that have been agreed, and where there's predictability, is a very important component of attracting foreign investment, or investment in general. So hence ensuring that there's stable inflation, that there's stable growth, that there's a predictable taxation regime, all those things are very important. Now, as you know, so the program will soon approach the halfway point in March next year. The macroeconomy has stabilized, and as was envisaged in the program when it started, we can soon start thinking more about structural reforms, how to raise Sri Lanka's growth potential to make sure that it will grow for a long time, and making sure that, for example, all sorts of red tape and impediments to running a business are eliminated. I think it's very important. Just to give you an example, in our travels around Sri Lanka, we went to Jaffna, where we met a very enterprising young lady who created a business on her own, making decorations out of little paper strips that are very beautiful during COVID. And this has been so successful that she managed to employ 10 people now. And essentially her client base is through an internet portal, and she reaches customers around the world and exports her products around the world, and that has generated employment for 10 people. So I think examples like that are a good story for Sri Lanka.
Certainly. Are you also saying that story also shows that entrepreneurial ability or skill is developing in Sri Lanka? Is that something you're seeing during your travels across Sri Lanka?
I would definitely say so. This this story certainly was one. So it's definitely something that we should think about more as we think about what structural reforms are needed to incentivize such entrepreneurial activities to promote employment.
Right. You mentioned structural reforms. I'd like to talk about state-owned enterprises restructuring, an effort backed by the IMF to look at SOEs that are a burden to the economy, but the present government has assured that certain state-owned enterprises which were earlier deemed or taken to be considered for privatization will not be. How does the IMF look at this, and how important is it for Sri Lanka to look at this SOE reforms?
So, from the program's perspective, given the weak state of the fiscal accounts when the program started, the main objective was to make sure that the state-owned enterprises would be able to operate on their own and would not be an actual or contingent liability for the Treasury. And that's why cost recovery pricing is such an important part of the program, that the consumer needs to pay how much it costs to generate electricity in the country or to obtain fuel, so that there isn't a buildup of debts in these state-owned enterprises that ultimately will come to the Treasury. So the program has been quite successful in that area. It's important to continue with cost recovery pricing and similarly limiting debts and reducing the legacy debts that are in state-owned enterprises. To help to support that effort, also the program has had some reforms with respect to transparency. So 52 key state-owned enterprises were chosen that are now publishing their accounts so as to increase the transparency and accountability for these enterprises. So I think that has worked quite well. With respect to your question on the ownership of the state-owned enterprises, that's not part of the program. The IMF has had different experiences with the sale of state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka. It is not part of the program. What, however, would be important is that these enterprises be managed prudently and in a commercial manner, so as to be as efficient as possible, because apart from avoiding a potential liability on the government, you also want to make sure that the consumer gets the best value for the money that they're being asked to obtain the service of that state-owned enterprise. And so hence running the enterprise in a commercial manner is important.
I wanted to ask you many more questions, but time is limited, and especially how the IMF works, whether IMF goes into debt restructuring, because that has been, there's been a lot of discussion about it. But again, I thought maybe on average, Sri Lankans are more educated, aware of the IMF, the economic situation, how the IMF program works. But how do you think the government and the people could be made aware of the relief obtained from this process, if any, on the common man and those who are actually vulnerable and underprivileged?
So debt restructuring, just to clarify what is our role with respect to debt restructuring, and then I'll answer your question. For us, the debt restructuring, that's a process whereby the government is going to its creditors and explaining the situation to the creditors, why the government got into trouble, and asking the creditors for relief. That is a process between these two parties that we are not part of. What matters from the IMF's perspective is that in that process, debt sustainability be restored. In other words, that process ensures that debt can be paid again. Future debt emerging from that process can be rolled over and paid in the future. We have these debt targets as a result of that, and that's what the government has been negotiating, and that process is going forward. So what is the relief that the population gets from that? Essentially, the relief that the government gets as a result of that process means it has to commit fewer resources to servicing the debt than it did prior to the debt restructuring. So it means lower amortization payments, lower interest payments for a prolonged time. It also means less foreign exchange being used to service debts. And that provides relief for the government to use resources for example, relief to the poor, increasing social spending, or providing any of the essential services that it does in health and education and so forth. So in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, $17 billion of debt service are shifting out of the program period that Sri Lanka does not need to service. And creditors are being asked for considerable debt relief, and that helps the country provide the services to the population that are needed.
Finally, how do you think the government should work to ensure that these hard-won gains that you talk about are ensured and protected, and what are your recommendations, the IMF's recommendations to the government? So
we think it's very important to continue with the reforms that have been agreed in the program with the guardrails of the program. That doesn't mean that adjustments at each review are not possible, as I had described earlier, and essentially pursuing the objectives of the program. Revenue-based fiscal consolidation, protecting the poor, cost recovery, pricing, price stability, debt sustainability, also safeguarding the financial stability, governance, a very important part of this that also helps build political support for the program, and then of course other structural reforms that would help promote growth.
Thank you very much for your time here. While you visit Sri Lanka often, we hope you get a chance to maybe travel around Sri Lanka and enjoy the beautiful touristic destinations in Sri Lanka as well.
Thank you. In fact, I did this summer. I traveled around with my family for several weeks all around. I think I've seen many parts of the country, and I was always struck by, first of all, how welcoming the people are in Sri Lanka, but also by their resilience in face of the many challenges that they face every day, and that were obvious to us even from just having met them briefly while traveling around. And I think in that spirit of resilience and coming together will help Sri Lanka emerge from the crisis.
I'm glad to hear that it's not the crisis. You were here because of the crisis. The crisis brought you here, but you've actually been attracted by the resilience and the beauty of our country. Thank you very much for your time here.
Thank you so much.
We were in discussion with the IMF Mission Chief to Sri Lanka, Peter Breuer, discussing IMF's work, ongoing program with Sri Lanka, the extended fund facility, and how Sri Lanka's reforms agenda in the long term will pay better returns for the country. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hydepark on Ada Derana 24. Good night.